Some of you may have seen that last picture and said, well, that's a very late-term abortion. Those don't happen very often in Canada. Well, Ruth mentioned that Stephanie Gray debated a late-term abortionist named Dr. Fraser Fellows some time ago at the University of Western Ontario. And when she asked him how late he did abortions, he said 23 weeks and 6 days. 1 day shy of that last picture you just saw. So I've painted what may seem like a rather nihilistic picture. Abortion, legal throughout all 9 months of pregnancy, happens about 300 times a day, 100,000 times a year, and we pay for it. So how do I propose to say that we can actually end this thing in our lifetimes? Well, our former Prime Minister John G. Diefenbaker once said that those who do not know their history cannot understand the present and can certainly do nothing for the future. Well, at CCBR, we have studied the past, and we have looked back to see how abolitionists and social reformers faced great injustices and how they abolished those injustices. And what we have found is that many groups throughout history faced injustices as horrific and as entrenched as abortion, and that they conquered these injustices in their lifetimes. I mentioned a little while ago a man named William Wilberforce. He was 28 years old when in 1787 he was invited to a meeting by a man named Thomas Clarkson. While he was there, they begged him to make his life's goal the abolition of the slave trade, and he agreed. And an organization called the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade was formed. And in 1807, the Slave Trade Act passed British Parliament, formally making the slave trade a part of history. Now, some of you may be doing the math in your heads and saying, well, like 2 decades, that's 20 years. It took William Wilberforce 20 years to get rid of the slave trade. Why is that? Well, the answer to that question is very simple. If we could sit down with a large group of people, decide something's unjust, and have it abolished, we could do that right here in this room tonight with abortion. But the reality is, history always tells us that public policy only changes when public opinion changes first. In order to effect legislative change, there must be a grassroots pressure, a grassroots force, because politicians only respond to force. But William Wilberforce was quite aware of this. Can I get a new clicker? And what he did was, with the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade, he got to work with his educational work. So what he did was he began to distribute hundreds of thousands of graphic images to the British public. These images made the African slaves a reality to the public. Am I not a man and a brother? When people saw these images, the Africans that were an abstract concept to them became real, and they realized that their lifestyle was being supported by the blood of real people. Public opinion began to shift in sympathy for abolition. But what historians tell us was the most effective tool that William Wilberforce used was this diagram that they released in 1788. It is a diagram of the slave ship Brooks, and it showed slaves packed into the hold like cargo. When the British public saw these pictures and realized that the slave trade was having a horrific impact on the lives of real people, they demanded a change. The grassroots will was there. The politicians responded, and the Slave Trade Act was passed. Moving on into the 20th century in the United States, there were several great injustices facing the American public at that time. One of them was child labor practices. Now at this time, children were being forced to work in factories for starvation wages, long hours, and what was happening was often the children were even being crushed in the factory machinery. Now, a group of people in 1908 formed an organization called the National Child Labor Committee. And they realized that these practices were denying children an education, denying them often their very lives and any chance for a real future. And in deciding how exactly they were going to address this problem, how exactly they were going to effect legislative change, they looked back in history at the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade, and they hired a man named Lewis Hine. Now, Lewis Hine began to travel across the United States, and get into factories and get into different trades. And what he would do was he would photograph the victims of child labor practices. It was often very, very difficult for him because factory owners did not want the American public to know that their cheap goods were coming at the cost of children's lives and of children's futures. He often had to disguise himself as a repairman just to get through the doors of these factories in the first place. However, a mere 12 years later, the American public was fed up with child labor practices because Lewis Hind's pictures were splashed across the front page of newspapers. They were put inside magazines. He saturated the American media with pictures of child victims. Legislation was passed, drastically reducing child labor practices. Many people complained about these tactics, though. They said they got tired of seeing these pictures. Do you constantly have to harp on this issue? And Lewis Hind responded to them when this question was posed to him by a university audience by saying this: "Perhaps you are sick of child labor pictures. Well, so are the rest of us. But we propose to make you and the whole country so sick of these images that when the time for action comes, these pictures will be a record of the past." And we now know that these records are a picture of the past, and they are a picture of the past by very virtue of their existence. Now, moving on to the 1950s, America had not yet rid itself of great injustices. Segregation at that time was still a very real problem, especially in the Deep South. And segregation and the Jim Crow laws essentially denied African Americans real citizenship status. They weren't allowed to eat at the same counters. They weren't allowed to go to the same theaters. They weren't allowed to attend the same functions. If they tried to buck this unjust status quo, they were often beaten, they were lynched, the police beat them, even they had crosses burned in their front yards. So in the midst of all of this, in 1955, a 14-year-old black boy named Emmett Till left Chicago to visit his relatives in Mississippi. Now, Chicago was in a northern state, and therefore segregation was not really a big problem there. So Emmett Till might well have been very unaware of just how bad it was down south for his cousins there. So when he got there, he was bragging to his cousins, as 14-year-old boys will do, saying things like, "I have a white girlfriend, I have lots of white friends." His cousins didn't really believe him. And so on a dare, he whistled at a white woman as he was leaving a store. Some people report that he said something flippant like, "Bye, baby." What we know for sure is that several nights later, a group of white racists came for him at his uncle's house. They abducted him at gunpoint, and his body was found several weeks later at the bottom of the Tallahatchie River. When his body was discovered, the authorities in Mississippi realized that they had a big problem on their hands. They did not want the American public to find out what segregation was resulting in. When they saw the corpse of Emmett Till, they realized they had to hide this disgusting murder from the public. So they put his body in a casket, they closed it, they sealed it, and they shipped it back to Chicago in the care of Sheriff Strider under strict orders not to open the coffin. However, when the coffin arrived in Chicago, Mamie Till, Emmett Till's mother, refused to be part of the cover-up of her son's murder. She said, "Open the coffin or I'll open it myself." And when the coffin was opened, she saw what they had done to her boy. One eyeball was laying partway down his cheek. His nose looked like someone had taken a meat cleaver to it, and he'd been shot. When she saw her son, she had what some might consider a surprising reaction. She said, "Let the people see what I have seen." And she arranged an open casket funeral in a church in Chicago. People tried to talk her out of it. She said, "No, I want the whole world to see what they did to my boy." 50,000 people attended this funeral, taking their children with them so that their children could see the injustice of Jim Crow and the results of segregation. Jet magazine ran the photo you just saw on the screen, and the country gasped as whites and blacks alike realized they could no longer remain passive in the face of such injustice. And 100 days later, a woman named Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat, citing the picture of Emmett Till's battered face as the reason she could no longer remain passive. in 1965, a mere 10 years after a picture of a murdered boy spurred a woman to action, the Civil Rights Act passed, making segregation and the injustice of Jim Crow a part of history. Sociologists and historians will tell you that this picture was the catalyst for the nonviolent civil rights movement that eventually resulted in the success of the Civil Rights Act. Dr. Clenora Weems actually wrote a PhD thesis and book on that very topic. So we see, as we look throughout history, that social reformers have taken on great injustices, and they have defeated those injustices using the right tactics. They confront the culture, they expose the injustice, and they accept the resulting persecution. 20 years, 12 years, and 10 years. Great injustices were ended. And why is that? Well, as American pro-life leader Greg Cunningham often says, injustice that is invisible inevitably becomes tolerable. And who here tonight cannot say that Canada and we as Canadians are tolerating abortion when it happens 300 times every single day? But when we look back through history, we realize something else. Injustice that becomes visible inevitably becomes intolerable. And I want to repeat that one more time. Injustice that becomes visible inevitably becomes intolerable. That is how social reformers ended the slave trade. That is how social reformers ended the practices of child labor. That is how social reformers ended the Jim Crow laws. And that is how the End the Killing Youth movement will end the killing of preborn children in our lifetime. Thank you for listening.